writer's block. That's B-O-L-C-H. Because tonight is a selection of stories from Robert Bloch. Show of hands, who knows who Robert Bloch is? Each of these 3 stories tonight is a nod to 2 of Bloch's favorite authors, Poe and Lovecraft. Robert Bloch wrote a fan letter to H.P. Lovecraft at the age of 16, and Lovecraft encouraged the young boy to begin writing fiction and to submit his stories to Weird Tales magazine, and thus began a 60-year writing career that is one of the most distinguished in the horror and mystery field. And Robert Bloch is today, of course, most famous as the author of Psycho. He is also well known for having once said, "Despite my ghoulish reputation, I really have the heart of a small boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk." As I mentioned, we'll be running a bit long tonight. Shandon running long? Yeah, but this is a planned one. I think we'll be done about 8:17. I hope you can stick around with us. And besides, Finn Zedmore is here at 9 o'clock. So you know you want to stick around anyway, right? So be make it nice and easy for everybody except Caledonia, who has to do a quick shift over. I'm sorry. Anyway, our first story is a nod to a famous Edgar Allan Poe tale, and the first person to guess which tale gets bonus Poe points. This story was made into a short film starring Jack Palance and Grand Moff Peter Cushing. Our narrator is a bibliophile going to meet the world's foremost collector of everything related to Edgar Allan Poe. Launcelot Canning is a third-generation Poe collector. Both his father and grandfather were obsessed with the writer. In fact, the grandfather built a Poesque mansion in the 1870s that Launcelot lives in now. The present Canning, though, crossed over into unhealthy monomania long ago. This story is The Man Who Collected Poe. And for those keeping track of such things, it was first published in 1951 in Famous Fantastic Mysteries by Robert Bloch. During the whole of a dull and dark and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone by automobile through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of my destination. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with a feeling of utter confusion commingled with dismay. For it seemed to me as though I had visited this scene once before, or read of it, perhaps in some frequently rescanned tale. And yet assuredly it could not be, for only 3 days had passed since I had made the acquaintance of Launcelot Canning and received an invitation to visit him at his Maryland residence. The circumstances under which I met Canning were simple. I happened to attend a bibliophilic meeting in Washington and was introduced to him by a mutual friend. Casual conversation gave place to absorbed and interested discussion when he discovered my preoccupation with works of fantasy. Upon learning that I was traveling upon a vacation with no set itinerary, Canning urged me to become his guest for a day and to examine, at my leisure, his unusual display of memorabilia. I feel from our conversation, sir, that you and we have much in common," he told me. "For you see, sir, in my love of fantasy, I bow to no man. It is a taste I have perhaps inherited from my father, and from his father before him, together with their considerable acquisitions in the genre, you see. No doubt, no doubt, you would be gratified with what I am prepared to show you for an all due modesty. I beg to style myself the world's leading collector of the works of Edgar Allan Poe." Now, I confess that his invitation as such did not enthrall me, for I hold no brief for the literary hero worshipper or the scholarly collector as a type. I own no more than a passing interest in the tales of Poe, but my interest does not extend to the point of ferreting out the exact date upon which Poe first decided to raise a mustache, nor would I be unduly intrigued by the opportunity to examine several hairs preserved from that hirsute appendage. Narrator interruption. Tomorrow, by the way, is the anniversary of Edgar Allan Poe's death. Back to the story. So it was rather the personality of Launcelot Canning himself, which caused me to accept the proffered hospitality. For the man who proposed to become my host might have himself stepped from the pages of a Poe tale. His speech, as I have endeavored to indicate, was characterized by a courtly rhodomontade so often exemplified in Poe's heroes, and beyond certainty his appearance bore out the resemblance. As Launcelot Canning had the cadaverousness of complexion, the large, liquid, luminous eye, the thin, curved lips, the delicately modeled nose, finely molded chin, and dark, web-like hair of a typical Poe protagonist. Now, it was this phenomenon that prompted my acceptance and led me to journey to his Maryland estate, which, as I now perceived, in itself manifested a Poesque quality of its own, intrinsic in the images of the gray sedge, the ghastly tree stems, the vacant eye-like windows of the mansion of gloom. All that was lacking was a tarn and a moat, and as I prepared to enter the dwelling, I half expected to encounter therein the carved ceiling, the somber tapestries, the ebon floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies so vividly described by the author of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Nor upon entering Launcelot Canning's home was I too greatly disappointed in those expectations. True to both the atmospheric quality of the decrepit mansion and to my own fanciful presentiments, the door was opened in response to my knock by a valet who conducted me in silence through dark and intricate passages to the study of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellis panes, and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books of musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. Instead, they rendered more distinct that peculiar quality of quasi-recollection. It was as though I found myself once again, after a protracted absence, in a familiar setting. I had read, I had imagined, I had dreamed, or I had actually beheld this setting before. Upon my entrance, Launcelot Canning arose from the sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and he greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it I at first thought of an overdone cordiality. And yet his tone, as he spoke from the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him in a mutual discussion of our interest, soon alleviated my initial misapprehension. Launcelot Canning welcomed me with the rapt enthusiasm of the born collector, and I came to realize that he was indeed just that, for the Poe collection he shortly proposed to unveil before me was actually his birthright. Initially, he disclosed, the nucleus of the present accumulation had begun with his grandfather, Christopher Canning, a respected merchant of Baltimore. Almost 80 years ago, he had been one of the leading patrons of the arts in his community, and as such was partially instrumental in arranging for the removal of Poe's body to the southeastern corner of the Presbyterian Cemetery at Fayette and Green Street, where a suitable monument might be erected. Now, this event occurred in the year 1875, and it was a few years prior to that time that Canning laid the foundation of the Poe collection. Thanks to his zeal, his grandson informed me, I am today the fortunate possessor of a copy of virtually every existing specimen of Poe's published works. If you'll step over here. And he led me to a remote corner of the vaulted study, past the dark draperies, to a bookshelf which rose remotely to the shadowy ceiling. I shall be pleased to corroborate that claim. Here is a copy of Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and other poems in the 1829 edition. And here is the still earlier Tamerlane and other poems of 1827. The Boston edition, which, as you doubtless know, is valued today at $15,000. I can assure you that Grandfather Canning parted with no such sum in order to gain possession of this little rarity. He displayed the volumes with an air of commingled pride, cupidity, which is oftentimes the characteristic of the collector, and is by no means to be confused with either literary snobbery or ordinary greed. Realizing this, I remained patient as he exhibited further treasures. Copies of the Philadelphia Saturday Courier containing early tales, bound volumes of The Messenger during the period of Poe's editorship, Graham's Magazine, editions of the New York Sun and the New York Mirror boasting respectively the Ballroom Hoax and the Raven, and files of the Gentleman's Magazine. Ascending a short library ladder, he handed down to me the Leah and Blanchard edition of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, the Conchologist's first book, the Putnam Eureka, and finally the little paper booklet published in 1843, sold for 12 1/2 cents, entitled The Prose Romances of Edgar A. Poe, an insignificant trifle containing 2 tales, which is valued by present-day collectors at $50,000. Canning informed me of this last fact, and indeed he kept up a running commentary upon each item he presented. There was no doubt but that he was a Poe scholar, and as well a Poe collector, and his words informed tattered specimens of the Broadway Journal and Godey's Lady Book with singular fascination, not necessarily inherent in the flimsy sheets or their contents. "I owe a great debt to Grandfather Canning's obsession," he observed, descending the ladder and joining me before the bookshelves. "It is not altogether a breach of confidence to admit that his interest in Poe did reach the point of an obsession, and perhaps eventually of an absolute mania. The knowledge, alas, is public property, I fear. In the early 70s, he built this house, and I am quite sure that you have been observant enough to note that in itself is almost a replica of a typical Poesque mansion. This here was his study, and it was here that he was wont to pore over books and the letters and numerous mementos of Poe's life. What prompted a retired merchant to devote himself so fanatically to the pursuit of a hobby, I cannot say. Let it suffice that he virtually withdrew from the world and from all other normal interests. He conducted voluminous and lengthy correspondence with aging men and women who had known Poe in their lifetime. He made pilgrimages to Fordham, sent his agents to West Point, to England, Scotland, and virtually every locale in which Poe had set foot during his entire lifetime. He inquired letters and souvenirs as gifts. He bought them, and I fear stole them if no other means of acquisition proved feasible. Launcelot Canning smiled and nodded. "Does all this sound strange to you? I confess that once I, too, found it almost incredible, a fragment of romance. Now, after years spent here, I've lost my own objectivity." "Yes, actually," I replied, "it is strange, but you are quite sure that there was not some obscure personal reason for your grandfather's interest, A fragment of... had he met Poe as a boy, or been closely associated with one of his friends? Was there perhaps a distant, undisclosed relationship?" At the mention of the last word, Canning started visibly, and a tremor of agitation overspread his countenance. Ah, he exclaimed. There you voiced my own inmost conviction. A relationship, yes, a relationship. Surely there must have been a relationship of some sort. I am morally, instinctively certain that Grandfather Canning felt or knew himself to be linked to Edgar Poe by ties of blood. Nothing else could account for his strong initial interest, his continuing defense of Poe to the literary controversies of the day, and his final melancholy lapse into a world of delusion and illusion. Yet he never voiced a statement or put an allegation upon paper. And I have searched the collection of letters in vain for the slightest clue. Yes, it's curious. It's curious that you so promptly divine a suspicion held not only by myself, but by my father. He was only a child at the time of my grandfather Canning's death, but the attendant circumstances left a profound impression upon his sensitive nature. Even then, although he was immediately removed from this house to the home of his mother's people in Baltimore, he lost no time returning upon assuming his inheritance in early manhood. Fortunately, being in possession of a considerable income, he was able to devote his entire lifetime to further research. The name of Arthur Canning is still well known in the world of literary criticism, but for some reason he preferred to pursue his scholarly examination of Poe's career in privacy. I believe this preference is dictated by an inner sensibility that he was endeavoring to unearth some information which would prove his father's and his, for that matter, my own kinship to Edgar Poe. You say your father was also a collector? Ah, a statement that I am prepared to substantiate, sir, replied my host as he led me to yet another corner of the shadow-shrouded study. But first, if you would accept a glass of wine. He filled, not glasses, but veritable beakers from a large carafe, and we toasted one another in silent appreciation. It is perhaps unnecessary for me to observe that the wine was a fine old Amontillado. Now then, said Launcelot Canning, my father's special province in Poe research consisted of the accumulation and study of letters. Opening a series of large trays or drawers beneath the bookshelves, he drew out file after file of glassine folios, and for the space of the next half hour I examined Edgar Poe's correspondence. Letters to Henry Herring, to Dr. Snodgrass, Sarah Shelton, James P. Moses, Elizabeth Poe, missives to Mrs. Rockwood, Helen Whitman, Anne Lidge, John Pendleton Kennedy, notes to Mrs. Richmond, to John Allen, to Annie, to his brother, Henry, a profusion of documents, a veritable epistolary cornucopia. During the course of my perusal, my host took occasion to refill our beakers with wine, and the heady draught began to take effect. For we had not eaten, and I own I gave no thought to food, so absorbed was I in the yellowed pages illumining Poe's past. Here was wit, erudition, literary criticism. Here were the muddled, maudlin outpourings of mind gone in drink and despair. Here was the draft of a projected story, the fragments of a poem. Here were pitiful cry for deliverance and a paean to living beauty. Here were a dignified response to a dunning letter, an editorial pronunciamento to an admirer. Here were love, hate, pride, anger, celestial serenity, abject penitence, authority, wonder, resolution, indecision, joy, and soul-sickening melancholia. Here were gifted elocutions, the stammering drunkard, the adoring husband, the frantic lover, the proud editor, the indigent pauper, the grandiose dreamer, the shabby realist, the scientific inquirer, the gullible metaphysician, the dependent stepson, the free and untrammeled spirit, the hack, the poet, the enigma that was Edgar Allan Poe. Again the beakers were filled and emptied. For the love of God, Montresor! I drank deeply with my lips, and with my eyes more deeply still. For the first time, the true enthusiasm of Launcelot Canning was communicated to my own sensibilities. I divined the eternal fascination found in a consideration of Poe the writer and Poe the man. He who wrote tragedy, lived tragedy, was tragedy. He who penned mystery, lived and died in mystery, and who today looms on the literary scene as mystery incarnate. And Mystery Poe remained, despite Arthur Canning's careful study of the letters. As my father learned nothing, my host confided, even though he assembled, as you see, a collection to delight the heart of a Mabot or a Quinn. His search ranged further. By this time I was old enough to share both his interest and his inquiries. Come. He led me to an ornate chest which rested beneath the windows against the west wall of the study. Kneeling, he unlocked the repository and then drew forth, in rapid and marvelous succession, a series of objects, each of which boasted of an intimate connection with Poe's life. There were souvenirs of his youth and his schooling abroad, a book he had used during his sojourn at West Point, mementos of his days as theatrical critic in the form of playbills, a pen used during his editorial period, a fan once owned by his girl wife, Virginia, a brooch of Mrs. Clem's, a profusion of objects including such diverse articles as a cravat stock and, curiously enough, Poe's battered and tarnished flute. Again we drank, and I own the Amontillado was potent. Canning's countenance remained cadaverously wan, but moreover there was a species of mad hilarity in his eye, and evidented restrained hysteria at his whole demeanor. At length, from the scattered heap of curiosa, I happened to draw forth and examine a little box of no remarkable character, whereupon I was constrained to inquire its history and what part it had played in the life of Poe. In the life of Poe? Ah, a visible tremor convulsed the features of my host. then rapidly passed in transformation to grimace, a rictus of amusement. "This little box, sir. Now you will note how, by some fateful design or contrived coincidence, it bears a resemblance to the box he himself conceived and described in his tale, Berenice. As this little box is concerned with his death rather than his life, it is in fact this self-same box my grandfather Christopher Canning clutched to his bosom when they found him down there. Down there." Again the tremor, again the grimace. But stay, I have not yet told you of the details. Perhaps you would be interested in seeing the spot where Christopher Canning was stricken. I have already told you of his madness, but I did not more than hint in the character of his delusions. You have been patient with me. More than patient, sir. Your understanding shall be rewarded, for I perceive you can be fully entrusted with the facts. Now, what further revelations Canning was prepared to make, I could not say, but his manner was such as to inspire a vague disquiet and a trepidation in my breast. Upon perceiving my unease, he laughed shortly and laid a hand upon my shoulder. Come. This should interest you as an aficionado of fantasy, yes? But first, another drink to speed our journey. He poured, we drank, and then he led the way from that vaulted chamber, down the silent halls, down the staircase, and into the lowest recesses of the building until we reached what resembled a dungeon, its floor and the interior of a long archway carefully sheathed in copper. We paused before a door of massive iron. Again I felt in the aspect of this scene an element of evocative of recognition or recollection. Canning's intoxication was such that he misinterpreted or chose to misinterpret my reaction. You need not be afraid, he assured me. Nothing's happened down here since that day, almost 70 years ago, when his servants discovered him stretched out before this very door, that little box clutched to his bosom. He collapsed, in a state of delirium from which he never emerged. For 6 months he lingered, a hopeless maniac, raving as wildly from the very moment of his discovery as at the moment he died, babbling his visions of the giant horse, the fissured house collapsing into the tarn, the black cat, the pit, the pendulum, the raven on the pallid bust of Talus, the beating heart, the pearly teeth, and the nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity from which a voice emanated. Nor was that all, he babbled, Canning confided, and here his voice sank to a whisper that reverberated through the copper-sheathed hall against the iron door. He hinted at other things far worse than fantasy, sir, of a ghastly reality surpassing all the phantasms of Poe. For the first time, my father and servants learned the purpose of the room he had built beyond this iron door, and learned what Christopher Canning had done to establish his title as the world's foremost collector of Poe. For he babbled again of Poe's death 30 years earlier in 1849, October 7th, of the burial in the Presbyterian cemetery, and of the removal of the coffin in 1874 to the corner where the monument was raised. As I told you, and as I was known then, my grandfather had played a public part in instigating that removal. But now, sir, we learned of the private part of that initiative. We learned that there was a monument and a grave, but no coffin in the earth beneath Poe's alleged resting place. The coffin now rested in the secret room at the end of this passage, sir. That is why the room, the house itself, this house, has been built. I tell you, he had stolen the body of Edgar Allan Poe. And as he shrieked aloud in his final madness, did not this indeed make him the greatest collector of Poe? His ultimate intent was never divined, but my father made one significant discovery. That little box clutched to Christopher Canning's bosom contained a portion of the crumbled bones, the veritable dust that was all that remained of Poe's corpse. My host shuddered and turned away. He led me back along that hall of horror, up the stairs into the study. Silently he filled our beakers, and I drank as hastily, as deeply, as desperately as he. What could my father do? To own the truth was to create a public scandal. He chose instead to keep silence. to devote his own life to study and retirement. Naturally, the shock affected him profoundly, but to my knowledge, he never entered that room beyond the iron door, and indeed, I did not know of the room or its contents until the hour of his death. It was not until some years later I myself found the key among his effects. But find the key I did, and the story was immediately and completely corroborated. Today, sir, I am the greatest collector of Poe, for he lies in the keep below, my eternal trophy. This time I poured the wine. As I did so, I noted for the first time the imminence of a storm, the impetuous fury of its gusts shaking the casements and the echoes of its thunder rolling and rumbling down the time-corroded corridors of the old house. The wild, overstrained vivacity with which my host hearkened, or apparently hearkened to these sounds, did nothing to reassure me, for his recent revelation led me to suspect his sanity. That the body of Edgar Allan Poe had been stolen, that this mansion had been built to house it, that it was indeed enshrined in a crypt below, that grandsire, son, and grandson had dwelt here alone, apart, enslaved to this sepulchral secret. All this was beyond sane belief. And yet, surrounded now by the night and the storm, and the setting torn from Poe's own frenzied fantasy, I could not truly be sure. Here the past was still alive. The very spirit of Poe's tales breathed forth its corruption upon the scene. As thunder boomed, Launcelot Canning took up Poe's flute, and whether in defiance of the storm without or as a mocking accompaniment, he played, blowing upon it with drunken persistence, with eerie atonality, with nerve-shattering shrillness. To the shrieking of that infernal instrument, the thunder added a braying counterpoint. Uneasy, uncertain, and unnerved, I retreated into the shadows of the bookshelves at the farther end of the room, and I idly scanned the titles of a row of ancient tomes. Here was the Chiromancy of Robert Bloch, and the Directorium Inquisitorum, a rare and curious book in the Quarto Gothic that was the manuals of a forgotten church. And betwixt and between the volumes of pseudo-scientific inquiry, theological speculation, and sundry incunabula, I found titles that arrested and appalled me. De Vermis Mysteriis, and Liber Ibn, treatises on demonology, on witchcraft, on sorcery, molded in crumbling bindings. The books were old, but the books were not dusty. They had been read. Read them? It was as though Canning divined my inmost thoughts. He had put aside his flute and now approached me, tittering as though in a continued drunken defiance of the storm. Odd echoes and boomings now sounded through the long halls of the house, and curious grating sounds threatened to drown out his words and his laughter. Read them, said Canning. I study them. Yes, I've gone beyond grandfather and father, too. It was I who procured the books that held the key. It was I who found the key. A key more difficult to discover and more important than the key to the vaults below. I often wonder if Poe himself had access to this same tomes, knew the self-same secrets of that I do now. That the secrets of the grave and what lies beyond, or what can be summoned forth if one but holds the key, sir, the key. He stumbled away and returned with wine. Drink to the night and the storm. I brushed the proffered glass aside. Enough, I said. I must be on my way. Was it fancy, or did I find fear frozen on his features? Canning clutched my arm and cried, No, stay with me. This is no night on which to be alone. I swear I cannot abide the thought of being alone, not here, not tonight. I can bear to be alone no more. His incoherent babble mingled with the thunder and the echoes. I drew back and confronted him. Control yourself, I counseled. Confess that this is a hoax, an elaborate imposture arranged to please your fancy. Hoax? Imposture? Sir, stay, and I shall prove to you beyond all doubt. And so saying, Launcelot Canning stooped and opened a small drawer set in a wall beneath and beside the bookshelves. Yes, this should repay you for your interest in my story and in Poe. Man, know that you are the first other person than myself to glimpse these treasures. He handed me a sheaf of manuscripts on plain white paper, documents written in ink curiously similar to that I had noted while perusing Poe's letters. Pages were clipped together in groups, and for a moment I scanned titles alone. The Worm of Midnight, by Edgar Poe, I read aloud. The Crypt, I breathed. And here, The Further Adventures of Arthur Gordon Pym. And in my agitation I came close to dropping the precious pages. Are these what they appear to be? The unpublished tales of Poe? My host bowed. Unpublished, undiscovered, unknown, save to me and to you. But this cannot be. Surely there would have been a mention of them somewhere, in Poe's own letters or of those of his contemporaries. There would have been a clue, an indication somewhere, someplace, somehow. Thunder mingled with my words, and thunder echoed in Canning's shouted reply. You dare to presume an imposture? Then compare. He stooped again and brought out a glassine folio of letters. Here, here, here! Is this not the veritable script of Edgar Poe? Look at the calligraphy of the letter, then at the manuscripts. Can you say they are not penned by the self-same hand, sir? I looked at the handwriting. I wondered at the possibilities of a monomaniac's forgery. Could Launcelot Canning, a victim of mental disorder, thus painstakingly simulate Poe's hand? Read, then, read! Canning screamed through the thunder. Read and dare to say that these tales were written by any other than Edgar Poe, whose genius defies the corruption of time and the conqueror worm. I read but a line or two, holding the topmost manuscript close to eyes that strained beneath wavering candlelight, but even in the flickering illumination I noted that which told me the incontestable truth. For the paper, the curiously unyellowed paper, bore a visible watermark, the name of a firm of well-known modern stationaries, and the date, just 2 years prior to today's date. Putting the sheaf aside, I endeavored to compose myself as I moved away from Launcelot Canning, for now I knew the truth. I knew that 100 years after Poe's death, a semblance of his spirit still lived in the distorted and disordered soul of Canning. Incarnation, reincarnation, call it what you will, Canning was in his own irrational mind, as he was in his own mind, Edgar Allan Poe. Stifled in dull echoes of the thunder from remote portion of the mansion, now commingled with the soundless seething of my own inner turmoil, as I turned and rashly addressed my host. Confess, I cried, is it not you that have written these tales, fancying yourself the embodiment of Poe? Is it not true that you suffer from a singular delusion born of solitude and everlasting brooding upon the past, that you have reached a stage characterized by the conviction that Poe still lives on in your own person? A strong shudder came over him, and a sickly smile quivered about his lips as he replied, Fool! I say to you that I have spoken the truth. Can you doubt the evidence of your own senses? What, have you had a bit of underdone potato? I think not. This house is real. The Poe collection exists. The stories exist. They exist, I swear, as truly as the body lying in the crypt below. I took up the little box from the table and removed the lid. Not so, I answered. You said your grandfather was found with his box clutched to his breast and before the door of the vault that it contained Poe's dust, yet you cannot escape the facts that the box is empty. I faced him furiously. Admit it. Your story is a fabrication, a romance. Poe's body does not lie beneath this house, nor are these his unpublished works, written during his lifetime and concealed. True enough. Canning's smile was ghastly beyond belief. The dust is gone, because I took it and I used it. Because in the works of wizardry I found the formula, the arcana whereby I could raise the flesh, recreate the body from the essential salts of the grave. Poe does not lie beneath this house. He lives, and the tales are his posthumous works. Accented by thunder, his words crashed against my consciousness. That was the end-all and be-all of my planning, of my studies, of my work, of my life, to raise by sorcery the veritable spirit of Edgar Allan Poe from the grave, reclothed and animate in flesh, set him to dwell and dream, to do his work again in the private chambers I built in the vaults below. And this I have done, sir, this I have done. To steal a corpse is but a ghoulish prank. Mine is the achievement of true genius. The distinct, hollow, metallic, and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation accompanying his words caused him to turn in his seat and face the door of the study so that I could not see the workings of his countenance, nor could he read my own reaction to his ravings. His words came but faintly to my ears through the thunder that now shook the house in a relentless grip, the wind rattling the casements and flickering the candle flame. From the great silver candelabra sent a soaring sighing in an anguished accompaniment to his speech. I would show him to you, but I dare not, for he hates me as he hates life. I have locked him in the vault alone, for the resurrected have no need of food nor drink, and he sits there, pen moving across paper, endlessly moving, endlessly pouring out the evil essence of all he guessed and hinted at in the life and which he learned in death. Do you not see the tragic pity of my plight? I sought to raise his spirit from the dead, to give the world anew of his genius, and yet these tales, these works are filled and fraught with terror not to be endured. They cannot be shown to the world. He cannot be shown to the world. And bringing back the dead, I have brought back the fruits of death. Echoes sounded anew as I moved toward the door. Moved, I confess, to flee this accursed house and its accursed owner. Canning clutched my hand, my arm, my shoulder. You cannot go, he shouted above the storm. I spoke of his escaping, but did you not guess? Did you not hear it from the thunder, the grating of the door? I pushed him aside, and he blundered backward, upsetting the candelabra, so the flames licked now across the carpeting. Wait! Have you not heard his footstep on the stair? Madman! I tell you that he now stands without the door. A rush of wind, a roar of flame, a shroud of smoke rose all about us. Throwing open the huge antique panels to which Canning pointed, I staggered into the hall. I speak of wind, of flame, of smoke, enough to obscure all vision. I speak of Canning's screams, and of thunder loud enough to drown all sound. I speak of terror born of loathing, and of desperation enough to shatter all my sanity. And despite these things, I can never erase from my consciousness that which I beheld as I fled past the doorway down the hall. There, without the doors, there did stand a lofty and enshrouded figure, a figure all too familiar, with pallid features, high domed forehead, the mustache set above a mouth. My glimpse lasted but an instant during which the man, the corpse, the apparition, the hallucination, call it what you will, moved forward into the chamber and clasped Canning to his breast in an unbreakable embrace. Together the two figures tottered toward the flames, which now rose to blot out vision forevermore. And from that chamber, from that mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, and now fire came to claim the house of Canning for its own. And suddenly there shot along the path before me a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. But it was only the flames, rising in supernatural splendor to consume the mansion, the secrets of the man who collected Poe. Forevermore. So, I hope you like that. And scooting right along, our next tale is a cosmic eldritch horror tale, and of course a nod to HP Lovecraft. It is about a man's quest for arcane knowledge, immortal life in a dank and dark and haunted tomb. It places easily with some of the best of Lovecraft's works. This is one of Bloch's earliest stories, written when he was just 17 years old. The Secret in the Tomb, published Weird Tales, 1935. The wind howled strangely over a midnight tomb. The moon hung like a golden bat over ancient graves, glaring through the wan mist with its baleful 𝕹𝕃𝕆ℍ. Terrors not of the flesh might lurk among cedar-shrouded sepulchres, or creep unseen amid shadowed cenotaphs, for this was unhallowed ground. But tombs hold strange secrets, and they are mysteries blacker than the night and more leprous than the moon. It was in search of such a secret place that I came, alone and unseen, to my ancestral vaults at midnight. My people had been sorcerers and wizards in the olden days, so lay apart from the resting place of other men. Here in this moldering mausoleum, in a forgotten spot, surrounded only by the graves of those who had been their servants. But not all the servants lay here, for there are those who do not die. On through the mist I pressed to where the crumbling sepulchre loomed among the brooding trees. The wind rose to torrential violence as I trod the obscure pathway to the vaulted entrance, extinguishing my lantern with malefic fury. Only the moon remained to light my way in the luminance unholy, and thus I reached the nitrous, fungus-bearded portals of the family vault. Here the moon shone upon a door that was not like other doors, a single massive slab of iron embedded in monumental walls of granite. Upon its outer surface was neither handle, lock, nor keyhole, but the whole was covered with carvings portentous of a leering evil. Cryptic symbols whose allegorical significance filled my soul with a deeper loathing than mere words can impart. They are things that are not good to look at upon, and I did not care to dwell too much in thought on the possible genesis of a mind whose knowledge could create such horrors in concrete form. So in blind and trembling haste, I chanted the obscure litany and performed the necessary obeisances demanded in the ritual I had learned. And at their conclusion, the cyclopean portal swung open. Within was darkness, deep, funereal, ancient, yet somehow uncannily alive. It held a pulsing adumbration, a suggestion of muted yet purposeful rhythm, and overshadowing all an air of black, impinging revelation. The simultaneous effect upon my consciousness was one of those reactions misnamed intuitions. I sensed the shadows know queer secrets, and there are some skulls that have reason to grin. Yet I must go into the tomb of my forebears. Tonight the last of all our lines would meet the first. For I was the last of that line. Jeremy Strange had been the first, he who fled from the Orient to seek refuge in centured Eldertown, bringing with him the loot of many tombs and a secret forever nameless. It was he who had built his sepulchre in the twilight woods where the witch light gleams, and here he had interred his own remains, shunned in death as he had been in life. Not buried with him was a secret. Yes, buried with him was that secret, and it was this secret that I had come to seek. Nor was I the first in so seeking, for my father and his father before me, indeed the eldest of each generation back to the days of Jeremy Strange himself, had likewise sought that which was so maddeningly described in the wizard's diary, the secret of eternal life after death. The musty yellow tome had been handed down to the elder son of each successive generation, and likewise, so it seemed, the dread atavistic craving for black and accursed knowledge. The thirst for which, coupled with the damnably explicit hints set forth in the warlock's record, had sent every one of my paternal ancestors so bequeathed to a final rendezvous in the night to seek their heritage within this tomb, and what they found, well, none could say, for none had ever returned. And now here I was. And it was, of course, a family secret. The tomb was never mentioned. It had indeed been virtually forgotten with the passage of years that had likewise eradicated many of the old legends and fantastic accusations about the first Strange that had once been common property in the village. The family, too, had been mercifully spared all knowledge and the curse-ridden end to which so many of its men had come. Their secret delvings into the black arts, the hidden library of antique lore and demonological formula brought by Jeremy from the East, the diary, its secret, all were undreamt of save by the eldest sons. The rest of the line prospered. There had been sea captains, soldiers, merchants, statesmen. Fortunes were won. Many departed from the old mansion on the Cape, so that in my father's time he had lived there alone with the servants and myself. My mother died at my birth, and it was a lonely youth I spent in that great brown house, with a father half crazed by the tragedy of my mother's end, and shattered by the monstrous secret of our line. It was he who initiated me into the mysteries and arcana to be found amid the shuddery speculations of such blasphemies as the Necronomicon, the Book of Iban, the Kabbalah of Sabbath, and the pinnacle of literary madness, Ludwig Prim's Mysteries of the Worm. There were grim treatises on anthropomancy, necrology, lycanthropical and vampiristic spells and charms, witchcraft, and long rambling screeds in Arabic, Sanskrit, and prehistoric ideography on which lay the dust of centuries. After all these he gave me, and more, all of them, and there were times when he would whisper strange stories about voyages he'd taken in his youth, of islands in the sea, the queer survivals, spawning dreams beneath Arctic ice. And one night he told me of the legend of the tomb in the forest, and together we turned the worm-riddled pages of the iron-bound diary that was hidden in the panel above the chimney corner. I was very young, but not too young to know certain things, and as I swore to keep the secret as so many had sworn before me, I I had a queer feeling that the time had come for Jeremy to claim his own. For in my father's somber eyes was the same light of the dreadful thirst for the unknown, curiosity, an inward urge that had glowed in the eyes of all the others before him, previous to the time they had announced their intention of going on a trip or joining up or attending to a business matter. Most of them had waited till their children were grown or their wives had passed on, but whenever they had left, whatever their excuse, they had never returned. 2 days later, my father disappeared after leaving word with the servants that he was spending the week in Boston. Before the month was out, there was the usual investigation, the usual failure. A will was discovered among my father's paper, leaving me as sole heir, but the books and the diary were secure in the secret rooms and panels known to me alone. Life went on. I did the usual things in the usual way. I attended university, I traveled, I returned at last to the house on the hill, alone. But with me I carried a mighty determination. I alone could thwart that curse. I alone could grasp the secret that cost the lives of 7 generations, and I alone must do so. The world had naught to offer one who had spent his youth in the study of the mocking truths that lie beyond the outward beauties of a purposeless existence, and I was not afraid. I dismissed the servants, I ceased communication with distant relatives and a few close friends, and I spent my days in the hidden chambers amid the elder lore, seeking a solution or a spell of such potency as would serve to dispel for ever the mystery of the tomb. 100 times I reread that hoary script, the diary whose fiend-penned promise had driven men to doom. I searched amid the satanic spells and cabalistic incantations of 1,000 forgotten necromancers. I delved into the pages of impassioned prophecy. I burrowed into secret legendary lore whose written thoughts writhed through me like serpents from the pit. It was in vain. All I could learn was a ceremony by which access could be obtained to the tomb in the wood. 3 months of study had worn me to a wraith, and filled my brain with the diabolic shadows of charnel-spawned knowledge, but that was all. And then, as if in mockery of my madness, there had come the call this very night. I'd been seated in the study, pondering upon a maggot-eaten volume of Heraclius' Occultus, when without warning I felt a tremendous urge keening through my weary brain. It beckoned and allured with unutterable promise, like the mating cry of the Lamia of old, and yet at the same time it held an inexorable power whose potence could not be defied or denied. The inevitable was now at hand. I had been summoned to the tomb. I must follow the beguiling voice of inner consciousness that was the invitation and the promise that sounded in my soul like the ultra-rhythmic piping of transcosmic music. So I had come, alone and weaponless, to the lonely woods and to that wherein I would meet my destiny. The moon rose redly over the manor as I left, but I did not look back. I saw its reflection in the waters of the brook that crept between the trees, and the light the water was as blood. Then the fog rose silently from the swamp, and a yellow ghost light rode the sky, beckoning me on from behind the black and bloated trees whose branches, swept by a dismal wind, pointed silently toward that distant tomb. Roots and creepers impeded my feet, vines and brambles restrained my body, but in my ears thundered a chorus of urgency that cannot be described and which could not be delayed by nature or man. Now, as I hesitated upon the doorstep, a million idiot voices gibbered an invitation into that mortal mind could not withstand. Through my brain resounded the horror of my heritage, the insatiable craving to know the forbidden, to mingle and become one with it. A paean of hell-born music crescendoed in my ears, and earth blotted out in a mad urge that engulfed all being. I paused no longer upon the threshold. I went in where the smell of death filled the darkness. It was like the sun over Yuggoth. The door closed, and then came what? I do not know. I only realized that suddenly I could see and feel and hear, despite darkness and dankness and silence. I was in the tomb. Its monumental walls and lofty ceiling were black and bare, lichened by the passage of centuries. In the center of the mausoleum stood a single black slab of black marble. Upon it rested a gilded coffin, set with strange symbols and covered by the dust of ages. I knew instinctively what it must contain, and the knowledge did not serve to put me at my ease. I glanced at the floor, then I wished I hadn't. Upon the debris-strewn base beneath the slab lay a ghastly, disarticulated group of mortuary remains, half-flesh cadavers and desiccated skeletons. When I thought of my father and the others, I was possessed of a sickening dismay. They too had sought, and they had failed. And now I had come, alone, to find that which had brought them to an end, unholy and unknown. The secret in the tomb. Mad eagerness filled my soul. I too would know. I must. As in a dream, I swayed to the gilded coffin. A moment I tottered above it, and then with a strength born of delirium I tore away the paneling and I lifted the gilded lid, and then I knew it was no dream, for dreams cannot approach the ultimate horror that was the creature lying within the coffin, that creature with eyes like a midnight demon's and a face of loathsome delirium that was like the death, like a mask of a devil. It was smiling, too, as it lay there, and my soul shrieked in the tortured realization that it was alive. And then I knew it all. The secret and the penalty paid by those who sought it, and I was ready for death, but horrors had not ceased, for even as I gazed, it spoke, in a voice like the hissing of a black slug. And there within the nighty gloom it whispered the secret, staring at me with ageless, deathless eyes, so that I should not go mad before I heard the whole of it. All was revealed. The secret crypts of blackest nightmare where the tomb spawn dwell, and of a price whereby a man may become one with the ghouls, living after death as a devourer in the darkness. Such a thing had it become, and from this shunned accursed tomb had sent the call to the descending generations, that when they came there might be a ghastly feast, whereby it might continue a dread eternal life. I, it breathed, would be the next to die, and in my heart I knew that it was so. I could not avert my eyes from its accursed gaze, nor free my soul from its hypnotic bondage. The thing on the bier cackled with unholy laughter. My blood froze, for I saw two long, lean arms, like the rider limbs of a corpse, steal slowly toward my fear-constricted throat. The monster sat up, and even in the clutches of my horror I realized there was a dim and awful resemblance between the creature in the coffin and a certain ancient portrait back in the hall. But this was a transfigured reality. Jeremy the man had become Jeremy the ghoul, and I knew that it would do no good to resist. Two claws, cold as flames of icy hell, fastened around my throat. Two eyes, bored like maggots through my frenzied being. A laughter born of madness alone cachinnated in my ears like the thunder of doom. The bony fingers tore at my eyes and nostrils, held me helpless, while yellow fangs champed nearer and nearer to my throat. The world spun, wrapped in a mist of fiery death. Suddenly the spell was broken. I wrenched my eyes away from that slavering evil face, and instantly, like a cataclysmic flash of light, came realization. This creature's power was purely mental. By that alone were my ill-fated kinsmen drawn here, by that alone were they overcome. But once one were free from the strength of the monster's awful eyes, good God, was I going to be the victim of a crumbled mummy? My right arm swung up, striking the horror between the eyes. There was a sickening crunch. Then dead flesh yielded before my hand as I seized the now faceless lich in my arms, and I cast it into fragments upon the bone-covered floor. Streaming with perspiration and mumbling in hysteria and terrible revulsion, I saw the moldy fragments move even in a second death. A severed hand crawled across the flagging upon musty, shredded fingers. A leg began to roll with the animation of grotesque, unholy life. With a shriek, I cast a lighted match upon that loathsome corpse, and I was still shrieking as I clawed open the portals and rushed out of the tomb and into the world of sanity, leaving behind me a smoldering fire, from whose charred heart a terrible voice still faintly moaned its tortured requiem to that which had once been Jeremy Strange. That tomb is raised now, and with its forest graves and all the hidden chambers and manuscripts that serve as a reminder of a ghoul-ridden memories that can never be forgot. For earth hides a madness, and dreams a hideous reality, and monstrous things abide in the shadows of death, lurking and waiting to seize the souls of those who meddle with forbidden things. Well, I hope you enjoyed the tale. I know I did. That one, and like the next one we're going to go through, I have not read before, so they're new to me too. Ta-da. Speaking of which, it's a short one. I think we can make it through. Our final tale this evening is another nod to Poe, and more Poe points for the first person to identify which tale that is before the last line of the story. There's a bit of mythos lore here too, and a touch of Robert Louis Stevenson. A young wizard plans to hypnotize himself into two personalities, the good and the evil, with disastrous consequences for both, of course. Yeah, like I say, we're running a bit over. I'd really like to squeeze this in, though, if you allow me, so I hope you can stay with us. This is called The Suicide in the Study by, say with me now, Robert Bloch. Weird Tales, 1935. To see him sitting there in the dim-lit darkness of the study, one would never have suspected him for what he was. Wizards nowadays are not garbed in the cabalistic robes of silver and black. Instead, they wear purple dressing gowns. It is not required of them that their eyebrows meet, their nails grow long as talons, and their eyes flame like emerald imprisoned dreams. Nor are they necessarily bent and furtive and old. This one was not. He was young and slim, almost imperially straightforward. He sat beneath the lamplight in the great oak-paneled room, a dark, handsome man of perhaps 35 years of age. There was little of cruelty or malice visible in his keen, clear-featured face, and little of madness in his eyes. Yet he was a wizard just as surely as if he lurked over human sacrifices in the skull-strewn darknesses of forbidden tombs. It was only necessary for one to survey the walls of his study for corroboration. Only a wizard would possess those moldering, maggoty volumes of monstrous and fantastic lore. Only a thaumaturgical adept would dare the darker mysteries of the Necronomicon, Ludwig Prim's Mysteries of the Worm, the black rites of mad Louvet Keraf, priest of Bast, or Comte d'Erlet's ghastly cultist des Ghouls. No one save a sorcerer would have access to the ancient manuscript bound in Ethiopian skin, or burn such rich and aphrodisiac incenses in an enshrined skull. Who else would fill the mercifully cloaking darkness of the room with curious relics, mortuary souvenirs from ravished graves, or worm-demolished scrolls of primal dread? Superficially, it was a normal room that night, and its occupant a normal man. But for proof of its inherent strangeness, it was not necessary to glance at the skull, the bookcases, or the grim shadow-shrouded remains, to know its occupant for what he was. For James Allington wrote in his secret diary tonight, and his musings were far from sanity. Tonight I am ready to make the test. I am convinced at last that the splitting of the identity can be accomplished by means of therapeutic hypnotism, provided that the mental attitude conducive to such partition can be induced. Fascinating subject, that. Dual identity, the dream of men from the beginning of time. Two souls in one body. All philosophy is based on comparative logic, good and evil. Why then cannot such diversion and division exist in the human soul? Stevenson was only partly right when he wrote of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He imagined a chemical metamorphosis is varying from one extreme to the other. I believe that both identities are coexistent, that at once they are separated by auto-hypnotic thought, a man can enjoy two existences simultaneously, his good self and his bad. They laughed at my theory in the club. Foster, that pompous old fool, called me a dreamer, a dreamer. What does he, a petty scientific chemist, know of the basic mysteries of life and death? A glimpse into my laboratory would shock his smug soul into insanity. The others, too. Mob catering writers, pedantic falsos who call themselves professors, prim biologists who are shocked at the mention of my experiments in synthetic creation of life. What do such as these understand tanned. They laughed, the fools. They would shudder at the Necronomicon, burn it too if they could, burn it as their pious ancestors did 300 years ago. Witch baiters, skeptics, materialists, all. I'm sick of the whole silly pack of them. It is the fate of the genius to dwell alone. Very well, then, I'll dwell alone. But soon they will come to cringe to my door and beg for mercy. Beg me for mercy. If my work tonight only succeeds, if I can succeed in hypnotizing myself into dual personality, physically manifested. Even modern psychology claims it can be done. Spiritualism credits its possibilities. The ancients have furnished me the key to the problem as they have done before. Al-Hazrad knew many things. It was only the weight of the knowledge that drove him mad. Two bodies. Once I can achieve that state at will, I shall hold the key to powers forever denied to men. Immortality, perhaps, is only a step further. After that, there will be no need of skulking here in secret, no necessity of passing my researches off as a harmless hobby. Dreamer, Dreamer! I'll show them! I wonder what the other shape will look like. Will it be human? It must, otherwise, but I better not think of that. It is quite probable that it will be an ugly-looking customer. I do not flatter myself. I know that the evil side of my nature, while concealed, is undoubtedly dominant. There is danger, though. Evil is an uncontrollable force in its purest form. It will draw strength from my body, too, energy to manifest itself physically, but that must not deter me. I must make the test. If it succeeds, I shall have power undreamt of, power to kill, to rend, to destroy. I shall add to my little collection here, and settle a few old scores with my skeptical friends. After that, there'll be other pleasant things to do. But enough of such musings. I must begin. I shall lock the study doors. The servants have gone out for the evening. There'll be no one to intrude upon my privacy. I dare not risk using an electrically manipulated machine for fear of some untoward consequences of removing the hypnosis. I shall try to induce a hypnotic trance by concentrating intently on this heavy polished paper knife here on my desk. Meanwhile, I shall focus my will on the matter at hand, using the soul chant of 𝕹𝕃 as a focal point. Yes. I shall set the alarm for 12 o'clock. Exactly 1 hour from now. Its ringing will break the spell. That, I believe, is all I need bother to do. As an added precaution, I shall burn this record. Should anything go wrong, I would hate to have all my little plans disclosed to the world. Nothing shall go wrong, however. I have used auto-hypnosis many times before. I will be careful. I'll be very careful. It'll be a marvelous feeling to control two bodies at once. I can hardly control myself. I can find my body trembling in eagerness and anticipation of its forthcoming metamorphosis. Power! Very well. After this report is reduced to ashes, I shall be ready to undertake the greatest experiment man has ever known.
James Ellington sat before the shaded lamp. Before him on the table lay the paper knife, its polished blade shimmering. Only the slow ticking of a clock broke the sable silence of that locked room. The wizard's eyes were glassy. They shone in the light, immobile as a basilisk's. The reflection from the surface of the knife stabbed through the retina like a fiery ray of burning sun, but his betranced gaze never wavered. Who knows what strange inversion was occurring in the dreamer's bewitched brain? What subtle transmutation generated from his purpose? He had fallen into his sleep with the fixed resolve of severing his soul, dividing his personality, bisecting his ego. Who knows? Hypnotism does many strange things. What secret powers did he invoke to aid him in his fight? What black genesis of unholy life lurked within the shadows of his inner consciousness? What demons of leering evil granted him his dark desires? For granted they were. Suddenly he awoke, and he could feel that he was no longer alone in that nighted room. He felt the presence of another, there in the darkness on the other side of the table. Or was it another? Was it not he himself? He glanced down at his body, unable to suppress a gasp of astonishment. He seemed to have shrunk to less than a quarter of his ordinary size. His body was light and fragile, dwarfed. For a moment he was incapable of thought or movement. His eyes strayed to the corner of the room, trying vainly to see the gloom obstructed movements of a presence that shambled there. And then things happened. Out of the darkness, nightmare came, stark, staring nightmare, a monstrous, hairy figure, huge, grotesque, simian, a hideous travesty of all things human. It was black madness, slavering, mocking madness with little red eyes of wisdom and old evil, leering snout and yellow fangs of grimacing death. It was like a rotting, living skull upon the body of some kind of ape. It was grisly and wicked, troglodytic and wise. A monstrous thought assailed Allington. Was this his other self, this ghoul-spawned charnel horror of corpse-accursed dread? Too late the wizard realized what had befallen him. His experiment had succeeded, but terribly so. He had not realized how far the evil in his own nature had outbalanced the good. This monster, this grisly abomination of darkness was stronger than he was, and being solely evil, it was not mentally controlled by his other self. Allington viewed it now with new fear in his eyes. It was like a creature from the pit. All that was foul and obscene and anti-human in his makeup lay behind the grinning parody of a countenance. The beast-like body hinted of shadows that creep beneath the grave or lurk entombed within the deepest recesses of normal minds. And yet in it Allington recognized a mad atavistic caricature of himself, all the lust, the greed, the insane ambition, the cruelty, the ignorance, the fiend-spawned secrets of his soul within the body of a gigantic ape. As if in answer to his recognition, the creature laughed, and tentacles of horror gripped the wizard's heart. The thing was coming toward him. It meant to destroy him, as evil always does. Allington, his tiny body ludicrously struggling to move quickly while impeded by clothes now ridiculously large for his diminutive frame, raced from his chair, flattened himself against the wall of the study, his voice curiously treble, shrieked frantic supplication and futile commands to the approaching nemesis. His prayers and curses turned to the hoarse gibberings of a madness as the huge beast lunged across the table. His experiment was succeeding with a vengeance. His glaring eyes watched, fascinated as one great paw grasped the paper knife, and a fearsome laughter riddled the night. It was laughing. Somewhere an alarm clock rang, but the wizard could not hear. They found James Allington, lying dead upon his study floor. There was a paper knife embedded in his breast. They called it suicide, for no one could possibly have entered that locked and windowless room. But that did not explain the fingerprints on the handle of the knife. The terrible fingerprints, like those left by the hand of a gigantic orangutan.